Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Oko-Oto Chukwuemeka. Hello, Oko. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm great. And you are from Nigeria, but you're living in the UK, right?
Yes, I am.
Great. I just love Nollywood movies. But today we're not going to be talking about Nollywood. We're going to be talking about blacksmiths in pre-colonial Africa. Recently, I developed an interest in technology in the pre-colonial era in Africa. And the name of the paper that you wrote with your co-author is titled Warfare in Pre-Colonial Africa, an examination of the role of African blacksmiths. Oko, who is a
Yeah.
blacksmith? What's the job of a blacksmith?
Okay. Basically, blacksmith are people who use indigenous instruments or technology to fashion out tools, household tools. They use indigenous instruments to fashion out household tools, sacrificial or religious instruments, and warfare instruments as well. So that's who a blacksmith is. There are people who mine ore, iron ore, and then use it to transform it into some household instruments or equipment.
And let me read this quote from Ludwig Beck. And Ludwig Beck wrote, everywhere an original art of producing iron among numerous native tribes of Africa were not imported but original. The Iron Age revolutionized Africa and forever altered human civilization practically and symbolically. And in the article, it is also noted that the Portuguese admired the work of African blacksmiths.
That's correct.
But why was the blacksmith important? Yes, we know that he produced tools that were used in agriculture and other industries, but beyond economics, did he play a religious role?
Very well. The blacksmith, in fact, to blacksmithing was those who belonged to or those who were involved in the job of blacksmith were believed to possess some special spiritual powers because of the kind of knowledge which they had. And in traditional African society, you had what we call the god of iron. So these people actually belonged more or less to some kind of spiritual societies where they worshipped a god of iron that gave them the inspiration of iron working and how they could develop them into both spiritual instruments and tools and household equipment as well. So they had very deep, significant spiritual significance. And they could also predict, they also had that divine powers to predict, what could happen and how a particular instrument could be used.
Yes. The god of iron, his name was Ogon, right?
Ogun,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
The Yorubas called him Ogun. Other indigenous societies had names which they called the blacksmith, but the Yoruba people called the god of iron Ogun.
And the
And that particular knowledge was widespread across different societies. For instance, in Igbo land, in Igbo, you had a community called Igbo where that particular knowledge was domiciled. People from that particular local government or within that particular area had very good knowledge of iron smelting and blacksmithing.
and the Mandi blacksmiths control a force called Niyama. This means that they control all energy and power in the village as well as the makeup and workings of the Mandi society. Among the Bamama people, blacksmiths are also experts in divination, amulet making, and as well as the practice of medicines due to their extensive knowledge of the spirit of Ogon. So, Oko,
Okay.
blacksmiths, were they physically involved in warfare?
Um, they were involved in warfare from two dimensions. One, they were not involved in the actual fighting, but there were auxiliary forces, auxiliaries in the sense that most of the times they accompanied the warriors to the warfare, to the war front, in order to fix some worn out war equipment like spears. So they operated from the background. And at most times, they also operated from the background to fortify, spiritual fortification of those instruments. So they were not directly involved, just like you have in modern day warfare, where you have people at the control room, you have reserve forces and all of that. The blacksmiths operated in disguise. So they were not involved in the actual warfare, but they were involved as, you know, carriers and also as repairers and molders of the warfare equipment. So they accompanied the warriors. They had their own station where they stayed, you know, gathered worn out war equipment, repairs, fortification, and all of that. So they played quite a number of roles in pre-colonial warfare, as you can find in our paper.
And Oku, blacksmiths, did they invest in an apprenticeship program? So in Africa, were the senior blacksmiths mentoring younger people who were interested in the profession?
Very well, yeah. You know, apprenticeship is a system that cuts across most indigenous societies in Africa. So the blacksmith, for instance, from where I come from, essentially had, you know, apprentice people they called more or less their boys who were undergoing training in that art in order to take over from them when they were long gone. Like I mentioned before, it was not a very common knowledge. So it required some very intense and periodic training for someone to become a blacksmith. So they had apprentices whom they mentored through the process and who took over from them in the event of their demise. Yes, they did have apprentices.
And where are you from exactly?
Okay, I'm from the southeastern part of Nigeria, precisely from Igbo land and Afikpo, precisely.
Oh, you're Igbo. I interviewed Paul Igwe recently. He's another Igbo academic, and I've written quite a few pieces on the Igbo people. Even in your
Oh, that's,
article, you were writing about the Igbo people and mercenaries.
yeah.
Yeah, you could tell us a little about that. Let me read what I'm talking about. The O the O the Oafia people in pre-colonial times were remarkable warriors who were often hired as mercenaries by other Igbo
Mhm.
communities.
Okay.
Yes, if you wish, you
Yeah,
could.
that's very true. The Ohafia people were very, they were very warrior kind of people. Okay. And amongst them, they were often hired as mercenaries, you know, to fight other people's wars. You know, there were also the Abriba people, even among some people from Nkwere and Ikwo in Igbo land, these people were or served as mercenaries in in warfare. So the Ohofia people, for instance, were quite remarkable for this particular trait. You know, a lot of people hired them to fight their wars. So it's a verifiable fact, and we still have remnants of this particular history, you know, in present day Ohafia society.
Oku, why did Africans conduct warfare? What were the reasons that usually led to war?
Well, the reasons that usually led to war, you know, in pre-colonial Africa has not changed differently from what we have today. One of the very obvious reasons for which people went to war was for territorial expansion. You know, like we understand from social Darwinism that, you know, that struggle for survival and to expand a particular living space when one no longer feels satisfied or when one wants to expand their, you know, the scope of their natural resources. So warfare in pre-colonial Africa was fought essentially one to maintain territorial sovereignty, you know, where people were trying to invade another person's territory. You know, so that was one very good reason of fighting wars. And most importantly, There were some quite prevalent practices in Africa that elicited warfare. Some things such as trade, when people were engaged in inter-group trade and inter-group relations, and maybe there are instances of kidnapping or headhunting and all of that, these things could trigger a reaction or a security reaction from neighboring communities who would in turn, go to war with the other people just to show their grievances. So there were a number of reasons, like I mentioned. One of it was territorial expansion, and the other was also to secure trade routes and to secure trade routes. Yeah. So there were a number of reasons for which wars were fought in pre-colonial Africa.
So your paper covered the significance of blacksmiths in various industries, but I'm just going to ask this question that's not directly related to the paper. Blacksmiths, did they play any role in the government? Were they advisors to royalty? I'm just curious.
Can you say that again, please?
Blacksmiths, did they play any role in the government? Were they advisors to royalty? Based on what you have read, I'm just curious.
Certainly they did. The blacksmith is his position, he, because of the uniqueness of his occupation, he was more or less indispensable in the politics of the state in pre-colonial Africa. And what I mean by that is that because these people possessed some special spiritual powers, which were not common, there were more or less consultants to some royal households. So the royalty or the political institutions will often consult them before going for war. So that way they have significance. They could predict whether a war will be won or lost because of those spiritual, insight which they had into some of these situations. So you find that they were often around the royals, in the palaces, trying to make predictions, trying to craft even the staffs of authority, trying to craft the spears and mold and all of that. So they did quite a lot of things that made them significant in the politics of states in pre-colonial Africa. Yes, there were.
Oku, I read the that the British found it difficult to subdue the Igbo people. It took them several decades. And in your article, you write that some of the Igbo peoples became experts in gun making. So could you tell us a little bit about the role of the blacksmith in gun making and modernizing African technology? And did this impact the ability of the British to subjugate the Igbos?
Yeah. One thing you should note is that the uniqueness of the blacksmiths in pre-colonial Africa. In fact, the blacksmith was the hub of technology, and of the technology of iron making revolutionized not just warfare, but the entire society. And when you talk about gun making, a popular tribe or a popular group of Igbo people called the Oka people, who found in Anambra State, and those in Nkwere, found in Abia State, are very popular for gun making. And we could see them play very important role during not just the colonial wars of resistance, but also during the Biafran War, where these people began to use their knowledge of gun making to produce locally made guns, which the people used to resist or fight during the Biafran War, the Nigeria Biafran War. So the blacksmith in pre-colonial Africa up to the colonial times were very, because of their role, or because of the knowledge of iron smelting and iron making, they were very, relevant in the entire politics of colonial resistance and up to the the Nigerian Biafran War. So they did play a very important role in the production of guns because they had that technology, and they only added, by copying and pasting the pattern or the kind of guns that the British brought, they could copy and replicate them using indigenous technology. And that was why they were able to sustain colonial resistance as well as sustain the Nigerian invasion of Biafra land between 1967 and 1960. And most importantly, during when the British came, in places like Oko-Oto, where there was a British expedition between 1901 and 1902, what we now know as the Ibinu Babi of Oko-Oto, or the Aro expedition. This knowledge, or because of the sophisticated weaponry that these people or these persons possessed, they were able to resist colonial invasion, and also to sustain the Biafran Civil War.
Yes, but what I find really fascinating in their paper is on page 78, it's that you write gun making in pre-colonial Africa was popular among the Akwa of the present-day Anambra, of the present-day Imo states of Nigeria. So this technology that the Igbos were so receptive to, when did they really begin to invest in it? Was it because of the slave trade? Was that how they were able to access foreign knowledge to improve their skills?
Like I said, that particular knowledge has some spiritual backing, if I use that word. And so it wasn't just when during the era of slave trade. Now remember that warfare is something that does not have an origin. Warfare is as old as man himself and as old as conflict. And so even in the Western world, they were fighting wars before even the 19th century. So in Africa as well, people fought wars. And so the idea or how the technology came about was man's search to improve his sophistications in warfare. And so you find people who were always researching on how to improve how to improve on the technology of warfare. From using wood to produce spears, they could now use iron ore to smelt it to produce spears, and the knowledge continued to grow. What happened was that the era of slave trade added to the sophisticated production of or use of blacksmiths, because as they needed to capture more slaves, they needed to raid societies, so they needed to have these equipments more sophisticated. So you see, the knowledge continued to advance from there, and up till the kind of technology that were used during slave raids between the 18th and 19th centuries, was different from the ones they started producing during the 19th century and 20th century, where during the colonial era. And it was equally different from the one that was produced in the later part of the 20th century. And all of these were as a result of technological revolution and improvement on already existing technologies. So yes, the era of slave trade added to the sophistication of this technology, but it didn't start from there. The colonial era also added to the technology, but it didn't start from there. The independent era up to the period of the Civil War also added to this technology. So it was more or less an advancement from one stage to the other until it is where it is today. But
Oku, could you tell us about the types of guns that were made? I see names like the Egbe Cham or Flint gun, the Egbe Niju. Tell us about these guns.
Okay, yeah, the blacksmith made quite a number of guns and amulets, arms and ammunition, if you call it that way. Now, There was the one called let me try to remember um the one you mentioned.
The Egbe charm?
Yeah. So that one looks more like a sling, if you know what that means. And so you have something that looks like a ball, you know, very thick ball, and then you put it on your sling, and then you revolve it, you rotate it, and then you fling it. It hits your enemy, and then it renders the person incapable. If it hits the person on the forehead, it weakens or it could kill the person instantaneously. And most times they went as far as adding some traditional, concocted charms to it to make it more effective. So that was the Igbo charm. And so when you fling it could hit a target with precision. Okay. And then there was the one you could mount in a place, put a lot of maybe stones, maybe pieces of iron inside it. You mold it like a bucket, put a lot of pieces of equipment inside it, and then you hit it, and then it could move and land somewhere and explode. So there was also the one. There was also the one they called Bonale. Bonale, that is cannons. Those ones were more or less used to frighten. It had the sound of more or less an atomic bomb. So you could sound it, and it can send fear. It didn't really have that particular gun did not really have destructive powers. It couldn't really kill, but it could send fear because the sound of it could send significant fear to the enemy territory that my adversary is strong or is advancing strongly. So these were the kind of guns that they made. Apart from this, they also made different kinds of amulets, which warriors could wear, fortify them with charms, and then when they wear these things, it had some protective powers, against the adversary.
Yes, the Egbe noodle is described as a canon of more complex composition. So I like to be as accurate as possible. Oko, scarification. Why was scarification important in warfare?
Yeah, scarification was important, like I said. It's a form of protection. It is a form of protection for the warriors. Okay, it is a form of protection because not everybody. It isn't meant for everybody. It was only the warriors, those who went to the war front that bear scarifications on their body. So that is one quite important function of the blacksmith. And so it was done to show that to more or less show bravery and strength and courage, of a particular warrior. So when you see a warrior having so much scarifications, it could send some level of fear. Before now, wars had fronts, there were battlegrounds. So when you find a warrior advancing with so much scarification, it could send some fear, into the adversary or the enemy. And so it was quite an important aspect of pre-colonial warfare that we also try to capture in the paper.
Yes, and other than the the religious significance of amulets, they were also functional. And let me read this for our listeners. War bracelets commonly used among the Kabawa people were metal rings worn around the wrist sharpened at the outer edge, which was protected by strings of hide, and it was used for close combat in cutting adversary. It was also the responsibility of the blacksmith to make these distinctive markings on the body of the warriors. Where cavalry forces were engaged in war, the blacksmith made protective metallic shields for the horses and their riders. As the violence of shock combat increased, heavier and metallic armors were built for the horse and his rider. They were both provided with a body shield, the chain armor, against deadly pointed missiles of the opponent. It seems to be quite technical stuff.
Yeah, so what that means is, what we mean there is that, uh, like I said, prior to now, warfare was not remote. Now we have remote warfare where people no longer need to go to the war front to fight. And so when you look at the macrocosm of war, of the prosecution of war in pre-colonial Africa, you will see that a lot of things were involved. Like we tried to mention, the horses were used, okay? And because these horses needed their own protection, they were more or less used to facilitate the advancement of the forces. So we find that these horses were also vulnerable to attack. And where a spear or a missile hits the horse, you know, it could render the horse rider or the warrior incapable of reaching their destination. So to protect the horses, the blacksmiths, made protective metallic shields for the horses to wear. And you could see that in some movies today that try to replicate lives in pre-colonial Africa, and even in Britain. I've seen a couple of movies where that try to depict the early days of British civilization, and so you see horses wearing thick shield, made with metals. So these things were to protect the horses from attack, and also allow the horse rider to reach their destinations without being attacked. And then for the horse rider himself, you find that they themselves also wore some thick armor, some thick metallic armor, as a shield against some guided missiles, spears, or arrows. So when you project your missile towards the horse rider, you see that, okay, it could just land on the shield and then fall off without really piercing their bodies. So all of these equipments and war gadgets were the exclusive preserve of the blacksmiths.
Oh, cool. Earlier we touched on it a bit, but we didn't immerse ourselves into the topic. But in contemporary Africa, are blacksmiths still important?
Very well. Blacksmiths are still very important, and their function hasn't changed so much. So when you look at till date, they are still involved in the production of a lot of household equipment. Things like knife, swords, they are still involved in their production. And even though wars have changed from what they used to be, they still produce this equipment because they have other very household use. Things like the production of axe is still the exclusive preserve of the blacksmith. Things like the production of some cooking stoves is still the exclusive preserve of the blacksmith. Things like the production of knives, the blacksmith is still very much involved in all of these. So iron smelting is still very much in vogue in Africa. And even in sculpting, they are also involved because their technology has also helped to use in the use of iron ore to smelt or design some royal gadgets, so they are still very relevant in contemporary Africa.
And
but the knowledge is gradually going extinct because civilization and Western education or formal education is trying to overshadow most of the function which the blacksmith performed.
we're wrapping up, but I see that you study politics and international affairs, and you are also of Igbo descent. This is not a research question, just a normal personal question. So, Oko, are you interested in the diplomatic relations of the Igbo people in the pre-colonial era?
Can you take that again, please?
Okay, are you interested in the diplomatic affairs of the Igbo people in the pre-colonial era?
Yes, I am.
Great. Do you have papers on the topic?
I have I have a work which I am doing just on intergroup relations between the Ehubo people and their neighbors.
Okay.
And my current research or my current PhD research as well, even though not so much on diplomatic relations in pre-colonial Igbo land, also touches a little on that, or touches a little on that because I'm doing a research on pre-colonial or indigenous community policing systems in Igbo land and using Afibo as a case study. And so when you look at that, you find out that there were prior to the conquest of that community, Ehubo, the people were very much involved in diplomatic. They had diplomatic relations with, not just diplomatic but also bilateral and economic relations with their neighbors. And when the British advanced, it was one of the reasons for which the British invaded and fought wars with the Ehubo people because they felt that these people were becoming too exploitative in their interaction or in the trade that developed between the British and those in the hinterland. So the Ehubo people, yes, I'm very much interested in the intergroup relations and diplomatic relations of Ehubo people in pre-colonial times. And I have some ongoing researches in that area as well.
All right, great. So thanks for coming to the show, but we're wrapping up and speaking to you has been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to you too.
All right. Bye, Oko.
Okay, thank you for having me.